To work for Andrew Allen particularly, what was it like? How would you describe his style of directing, producing?
Frightening. Andrew was extremely knowledgeable, not only about radio and what it could and couldn't do, but was also extremely intelligent and very erudite. So that when you came, you had to have done your homework, or you had better be prepared to admit flat out right away what you didn't know or couldn't pronounce or weren't sure of, because if you didn't, Andrew would let you know in no uncertain terms. Essa Young tended to be, I think, a bit more gentle, at least as far as I remember. But Andrew had an aura about him because he was Andrew Allen, and like a sort of famous personality, he used it. I think he thought of himself a bit as a sort of Canadian Orson Welles, you know? And that would be a bit frightening. In private, when you were with him or having a drink or something, of course, he was very funny, very witty, very caustic, but difficult.
What did it mean to be asked by a Mr. Guthrie? I'm saying that so that in your answer you might say Tyrone Guthrie, to join his company.
After I left the CRT in 51, 52, and the fifth year of the Straw Hat Players, we had brought over an English director. Murray and Donald had brought over an English director by the name of Peter Potter. And he came over and directed us. We did plays like The Cocktail Party, the TSL, and this is Summer Stock, which I co-directed with Peter. And at the end of the season, Peter offered Eric House and Donald Davis and myself work over in England if we wanted to go. Eric had been over in England for 5 years, I think, during the war, so he had no desire to go back. Donald and I, of course, had never been over, so we wanted to go. So we both accepted and went over, and I spent a year at the Glasgow Citizens Theatre in Glasgow, working with Peter. Then I left that and was in the first film of Rob Roy that starred an English actor whose name escapes me at the moment, but who was, again, short. So they hired a number of us who weren't too tall or too much taller to stand around him a lot so that he wouldn't look that much shorter than if he was standing up against the 6-foot guys. And I did that, and I stayed in England for a couple of years. That was the year that Stratford, back home, was starting. And Tyrone Guthrie had come over and had gone around to the summer stock companies and seen them all, had come up to Gravenor and had seen us doing, again, for me anyway, it was a production of The Importance of Being Earnest, and I was playing Algy, again, having played it some, I guess, 10 years earlier? No, 3 years earlier or something with the Everyman. So Stratford was, of course, big, exciting thing to happen theatrically in Canada. At the same time, television was starting. And so I left the country smartly. And I was working with Peter Hall in a company at Oxford, which included Maggie Smith as a young 17-year-old, and Billy Whitelaw, and Roderick Cook, who became famous over here, and Tony Tur. It was a great company. When I got one of Tony Guthrie's little postcards, which is what he used to send. Little postcard that would say, in my case, it said, something like, interested in having you play in the Stratford season of 1955, so-and-so and so-and-so, let me know. And I'd been nearly 3 years in England. I hadn't seen the sun for 3 years, I swear. It had been raining. I'd loved it. And I was working with Peter, who was an up-and-coming force in the English theatre. He's now Sir Peter Hall and ran Stratford for years. But I wanted to come home, and I wanted to work at Stratford, which was going into its third year. So that's what brought me back. And I came back, and I thought, oh, I'm a Canadian. I'm not an English actor, because when I went to England, I refused to play American parts. I would only play English parts, which were very difficult to come by because I didn't, particularly when I first went, did not sound very English. Fortunately, working in Glasgow, most of the Scots actors didn't sound very English either. So I sounded as English as they did. So that was fine. But once I got down to London, I really was working hard on an accent, which I could use in the plays. And when I first met Peter Hall, he said afterwards, he said he was astounded that I came in talking rather like I'm talking to you now. And then I launched in, I'd been playing Graciano on the road in The Merchant. And I launched into one of Graciano's speeches, and he was amazed that I could sound so English when I was performing, and so Canadian. So that's how he hired me. But when I came back, I suddenly realized that I had been playing a role for nearly 3 years of an English juvenile, something that I wasn't. And my friends, Mr. House, and particularly, who was at Stratford, fell about as soon as I opened my mouth. I say, Eric, old chap, how are you? Who was this stranger? So it was as if a weight went off my shoulders. And I thought, oh, this is where I belong, and this is where I'm going to stay. It sounds grandiose, and it's not meant, but I knew that I wasn't going to leave Canada again, and never did. And even I wouldn't go to the States except to do the odd job.
And so we have the story of how Guthrie picked you. It's great. Could you describe Tony as a director?
Tony, this was the third year, so he'd started the festival, and he was, to all the actors, about one step higher than a god. So again, I was terrified. I was playing, they were doing The Merchant, and I was playing, excuse me, I have to turn, Lancelot Gobbo in The Merchant. And I was terrified. I couldn't get an entrance. And Tony could be very hard on, and was very hard on a couple of the performers in the show. Thank heavens he left me alone, because if he hadn't, I think I would have broken. I don't know what I would have done. But he left me alone, and one day we were rehearsing, and I had tried everything on that stage. I had entered up the vomitoriums and down and under the things and out the sides for my first entrance. Nothing seemed to work. And they were rehearsing the scene before, and I was making my entrance at this point, walking out onto the balcony. And the scene before was in rehearsal, and there were a bunch of people sitting out who were singing. And I suddenly thought, I'm going to try. And I stood back, and I took a run, and while they were all standing and singing, I slid out on my stomach, right into the corner of the V, right between two legs. Fortunately, they didn't sort of go, what? They all kept just singing, thank heavens. So they exited, and the stage was empty. And I used to love pauses. They used to time my pauses. They used to stand in the wings with stopwatches in my youth if I had a pause to see how long I would go. It took me a long time to learn not to do that. And I let a pause hang just till I thought Tony would be about to say, Mr. Follows, are you going to make your entrance? And I had a little bag that I was carrying because I was leaving Shylock's employ. And I took a line out and I threw it. So it came up over the balcony, fell down onto the stage. Then I popped my head up over and said whatever the first line is, something about I won't work for him anymore, whatever. I knew I had it, had the entrance, had the character, relaxed. But Tony never said a word other than to support me. I think he knew how scared I was. Coming back, having spent 2 years in England, all my old friends who were doing Shakespeare, I'd been playing Shakespeare in England, all of them looking at me, okay, kid, show us what you've been doing over there. So he was a great director. I loved it while he was there. I was very sorry when he left, and I left not too many years after myself.
Was it a competitive company up at Stratford?
Never. Not ever on stage. I should qualify that, because I think that off stage, particularly after Tony left, there were a lot of actors who would go during the season laying the seeds for the following season. Something that never occurred to me. Very dense, very dense. So that they would talk to Michael Langham, who was the new young artistic director, I think. But on stage, there was never anything but this. Again, it was this thing that I was talking to you earlier, this feeling that although it was the third year of the festival, and my first, they'd had 3 years now of being a unit. All these people working together, Dougie Campbell and Bill Hutt and Eric and Dougie Rain, Peter Muse, all these as a team, producing theatre that was becoming internationally famous. And we all loved it. I remember when we did Henry V, and we brought the famous actors from Montreal, Jean-Louis Roux, Jean Gascon, Gabrielle Gascon, some of the ladies, and some of the people thought that there was going to be, and rather hoped, I think, that there would be a sort of clash between the English actors and the French actors, which would then carry over into the production. Well, of course, how could you not love these incredible performers who came in full of Gallic attack and approach and love and life? So we loved each other. And we had a ball with them, I think much to Michael's chagrin at one point. He really couldn't understand why we were getting along so well. I can remember in the curtain calls, Jean-Louis, I think Jean-Louis and I made our calls together. Maybe Jean Gascon as well. But every night they would teach me a French phrase which I could not possibly repeat. Now, so that as I was bowing, I could say this in French. And they would, of course, fall about, and I would be smiling at the audience and saying something rather rude in my execrable French.
You mentioned Michael Langham, by the way. What did he bring to his role as artistic director that was different from Guthrie?
Well, first of all, he was much younger and without nearly the years of experience and the years of handling actors of very high caliber. I mean, the Oliviers and the Richardsons and the Gielguds, people of that stature and difficulty or not, but Tony was used to that. Michael had been a prisoner of war for 4 or 5 years, very much a kind of intellectual. And for Michael, it was very difficult to communicate. At least it was to me. And I think to a lot of the others, his projection was intellectual. And we, of course, brought this sort of Canadian drive and vitality, which was more physical. I think that might have been a bit difficult for Michael then. I don't know, that's a personal opinion. I didn't do too well under Michael, and I only stayed about 3 more years, and then I turned them down 1 year because I didn't like what Michael was offering me. And that was the end of my connection with Stratford for many years, which was fine, as it turned out, because it led me into the beginnings of my television career, and my also going to as a founding member of the Neptune in Halifax.
The Canadian Players, you spent a while with them, eh?
I did, 4 years. Would you like some more? The Canadian Players had started the year before I came back from England. And the year I came back, I was asked to join the Canadian Players, which to me was the absolutely perfect continuation of what Stratford was. There we were working at Stratford during the summer, doing these plays, and then off we would go into what, for me, would be like bringing back the Everyman Theatre. We covered this continent, not only the West and the East, but most of the States as well. I can remember once when we were 32 straight hours on the bus. We were traveling from Salt Lake City to Victoria for a date that we had to make. And we only stopped to rest stops and to eat to get there. So we spent hours on these huge buses. We had an American agent who booked us in the States, and we would do tours where we would go to there, to there, to there, to there. Do you know what I mean? We would constantly say to Frank, who was our big New Jersey bus driver, wonderful, we'd say, Frank, haven't we been here before? Frank would say, with the cigar, yeah, yesterday. So we spent years on a bus. I still, to this day, shudder if I hear a Greyhound bus warming up, because our Greyhound bus was always warming up to take us to the theatre, back to the hotel, 6 o'clock in the morning to the next date. But we did great plays.
Some of the players in that, please?
Some of the players, well, Francis Hyland, who played St. Joan, my first year, Douglas Campbell, of course, Bill Hutt, George McCowan, became Francis's husband before he went into television. Who else? Eric never toured. He was doing a lot of television, so he didn't join us. Donald and Murray had started the Crest Theatre in Toronto a few years previously, back around the same time Stratford started, I think. So they weren't with us. There were a lot of actors who worked at Stratford and who would then come out on the road. Dawn Greenhalgh, my first wife. Oh, goodness. Others will come to me.
You mentioned the Crest just now. Who were some of the company members of the Crest that impressed you, that you looked to, that you realized you were in good company?
I didn't work very often at the Crest, mainly because when it started I was in England. Then I came back and I was 5 years at Stratford and 4 years with the Canadian Players. So that it was 58, 59, was getting into the 60s when I really even had a chance to work at the Crest. I only did a couple of shows. My favorite show that I did there was called My Three Angels, which they made a film out of with Humphrey Bogart and Aldo Ray and Peter Ustinov or somebody like that. My wife was in it, and Norman Welch, who had been with me on the Canadian Players, and an American actor who's married to Olivia Dukakis. Now, why do I remember her name and not his? I know, a good friend of mine, wonderful actor. And that show I particularly loved. And I think I may have only done one other one, a play called Bun Soup. Because I just wasn't in Toronto that often. And by the time I was, I think two gals who had taken over the Canadian Players were running it as part of the Canadian Players, and I had given up the Canadian Players when I left Stratford.
In 1962, you went to work with Hirsch at Manitoba Theatre Centre. Tell me about John Hirsch, please.
I can't tell you much about him then because, as I said, John was running the company with Tom Hendry, and I was asked to come out to do Arms and the Man, but John wasn't directing it. So the director was a chap called Desmond Scott. So I saw very little of John. I didn't work with John until the first year of Festival Lennoxville, if you remember that, which was in southern Quebec. Well, it's a region, Eastern Townships. And I did a play there that had been written by a woman by the name of Anne Henry, who was a Winnipeg writer and critic, and the mother of Donnelly Rhodes, of Danger Bay fame, and Tim Henry, another actor. And I did a play of hers about her father, and John directed that, and that was the only play John and I ever did, and I enjoyed that very much. John then later on took over the CBC and was the cause of my losing another series that I had just started doing about immigration official, and we'd done one show. John Colicos had been the guest star and had been very successful, and I was the immigration guy, and John didn't like it, the series. We had 4 other scripts ready to go, and he canceled it, which broke my heart.
What did he mean to theatre, though, in Manitoba? He may not have meant TV.
Oh, I think he meant an incredible amount to the Manitoba, the whole development of what is now the Manitoba Theatre Centre, although he was also extremely clever in having Mr. Hendry as his right-hand man, because Tom ran all the business of the theatre, which left John free to be as artistic as he wanted to be. And that is a consummation devoutly to be wished, if you can get that combination. Because then, as the artistic director, unlike Leon at the Neptune a few years later, when Leon had to do a lot of the business, although his business manager was excellent, but Tom was special. So that made, John, I think, had a reputation in Winnipeg for being this European madman, full of it, and a great director to work for. And I think that meant, and of course, carried on later years at Stratford, but I never worked for him.
Sums it up nicely. When did you first meet Leon Major?
I first met Leon Major in Toronto. We did a couple of plays together. Apart from doing a lot of Shaw, I also did a lot of Beckett and the German. Who? Brecht. Thank you. My mind, it's advancing senility. I can't even say it. And Leon directed a Brecht play that I was in, that we did, and then we also did for television. And we became very close friends. So when he was talking about, and he had this incredible dream, which was, I think, sort of based on the group theater in New York. His wife came from Halifax, Judith Major, who had been a script assistant at CBC in television. And her father was well known in Halifax. And this whole thing about starting a theater began, and they got involved, and they got Leon involved, and he wanted to create a company. Well, that was exactly what I'd been longing for since 1955-56 Stratford, and this is now in the 60s. So when he approached my wife and I, we had 2 kids by then. There was no hesitation that we would become part of a company that would be, to begin with, mostly upper Canadians, as we were called down there when we first arrived. When are you upper Canadians going home? As well as local performers from Halifax. And we would work on a year-round contract, which would include a couple of weeks off with pay, and pay whether we were in the play or not for the year. I mean, a European Stanislavski Russian type concept, if you like, which was wonderful. Unfortunately, it only lasted the 1 full year, but it meant that we all got down there. We met some wonderful people from Halifax: Joan Gregson, David Brown, David Murray, Dave Pickett and his wife, Mary McMurray, a lot of them. Halifax and the Neptune was, for all of us, again, an experience that I treasure now. I left there after 3 years. We were there for 3 years, and I was never asked back until their 30th anniversary, and they flew me down with some other people.
Was the Neptune pretty much set up by the time you got there, or was there a lot to do? Yeah.
It was hardly set up at all when we got there, so there was almost everything to do. All the wardrobe. We were opening again with the Shaw. We were opening with Major Barbara, in which I was playing cousins and my wife was playing Barbara. And then our second production was going to be Mary, Mary, an American comedy, and I was playing Bob, the husband, and my wife was playing Mary. Nothing was done. So we were rehearsing, of course, away from the theater, which they were building like crazy, and finding places to live and moving in. We had a 2-year-old and a 2-month-year-old, so we had to have help, so that when we weren't at the theater, we were home looking after the kids. So we were just totally up to here. George McCowan was directing Major Barbara, and Leon was directing Mary, Mary. And Mavor Moore had been brought down to play Undershaft, the father, in Major Barbara, and to direct one of the plays coming up in the season, because these were only the first 2 of about 5. They were going to do the 4 Poster. It's going to be, I think, the next one, which starred Joan Gregson, who was a Halifax. Yeah, and there were 3 or 4 Halifax people in, of course, the Shaw play, because it's a large cast. And then they were going to do Antigone, and then they were going to do Dial M for Murder to take us through the first summer into the fall. So we were terrible. I can remember about, it seems in memory, can't be, but it seems like it was about 2 days before we went into the theater for final rehearsals that I went to George and said, George, can we please rehearse the last act of Major Barbara? We divided it into 3 acts, and because we haven't touched that yet, and we're getting very close to opening. I can remember that. So it was busy, but it was, again, this thing that I keep harping on, that wonderful feeling of a group united to produce a product that was going to be good. And they were.
Leon's style has been described as, if things aren't going very well, he may single out one detail about one of the performers and make a big deal about it. And this seems to fire up all the bit players with a sense of creative importance, and it gets leading players into a contagion of invention. Does this make sense?
I suppose, in a kind of way, when you know someone well and have worked with them a lot, you accept the way they direct because you know them so well, and you don't think of it as being something that's manipulative in any way, because you know he's just trying to get the best out of you or out of someone else. I remember we were doing a play by Jack Gray called Louisburg, and David Brown, who was a Halifax lawyer who had left the law and joined us as a young actor, was playing one of the parts. And I was playing the governor, I think, of Louisburg. And David was playing this old manservant, and who was constantly making entrances and exits behind me. And being very young and playing very old, he was really playing very old. And I can remember stopping the rehearsal one day and saying to Leon, Leon, I cannot act if that young man is going to be constantly swimming across the stage behind me. Leon laughed. We all laughed. David cut it down a little bit, and on we went. My most fun with Leon ever was years later when I was running a theatre called the Griffin Theatre up in Barrie, north of Toronto one year, and I was doing a play called Love, which is a three-hander, and I had my ex-wife playing the woman, Eric House, and myself playing the two men. And I asked Leon if he would come up to direct this show for me, which he did. And the three of us just had a ball because we'd all worked together so much in the past. And of course, Eric, being Eric, had Mr. Follows, whose theatre it was, making a total fool of himself night after night. It was a great success, the show.
Mary McMurray and David Piggott got married. Do you remember any anecdotes about that? Lots of drink?
Nope. No. I remember them getting married. I remember, again, when I went down for the 30th anniversary, Mary and David and I got together with Leon, and we had breakfast the next morning, and it was wonderful to see the two of them. And it was wonderful, particularly to see Mary, because she had been a singer, I think, who had come down and joined us and became an actress and was a perfect complement in our company, along with all of us who were there. I should say that the end of the 3 years, I came very close to staying in Halifax. I loved the area down there. David Renton, I was going to say Piggott, but David Renton, who had come from Toronto as one of the original members, did stay and is still down there and has lived there all these years. It was gorgeous.
Just for your information, Joan Gregson has just moved to Toronto this year, I think.
Oh, for heaven's sakes.
Yeah. She was staying with friends or something. We interviewed her, and I guess she had to bail it because there wasn't a lot of work happening there. We haven't heard a great deal about Newfoundland, but I understand that with the Neptune you did tour.
We toured the Neptune, toured the Maritimes, but I never got to the Newfoundland. Got to PEI because we were the first professional theatre company to play in the Confederation Theatre. We were doing a play called John A. Beats the Devil by Tommy Tweed, who was one of the famous CBC radio writers and performers. And I was playing John A. John A. was a very tall, thin, hook-nosed Scot who was about as far removed from the way I looked. So I was putty-nosed and high-heeled and whatever to try. But anyway, it was great. And we opened the Confederation Theatre professionally. They'd done a Dominion Drama Festival, I think, previous to it. And we toured all around the Maritimes, but I never got to Newfoundland. I didn't get to Newfoundland until years later when I was directing television.
Okay. Mavor Moore, in the early days, you mentioned that he played in Major Orbra. What did he contribute to the success of the Neptune?
I think that's a bit difficult to say for me. I didn't work with him in the shows he directed. I had known Mavor, of course, before as a performer, but I think I was going to say his major contribution, but that would be a pun, seeing as Leon Major was the boss, was political, if you like, even more so than artistic. Now, I may be making that up, but that's my feeling, that Mavor was down there to help Leon. He had run companies, he had run the New Place Society, he had been in theatre since he was a kid, and I think he was there to help Leon, and he did a great deal.
Joan Gregson, do you have any specific anecdotes, or do you remember anything particular about her performance? Because we've spoken to her already.
Joan and I worked together a lot because she really became one of the, right from the beginning. She just wasn't in the first two shows, but she did, as I mentioned, the two-hander. with Bunny Barons, which the four-poster. So, and after that, Joan and I worked a lot, and I directed her, because I directed a number of shows. If Leon didn't direct them, mostly I did. So, Joan's a fine actress. I don't have any specific anecdotes to tell really about. I will tell you one story, which does not include Joan. There were three couples who came from Toronto. There were my then wife, Dawn Greenhalgh, and myself. There was Norman Welsh and his wife, and there was Bunny Barons and his wife, Debbie Cass. And we three couples were known as the Boring Barons, the Normal Welches, and the Fighting Follows, which summed up the private lives of we three couples. So we were the married couples. Deanne LeBlanc was a member of the original company, and her husband was Gary Leroyd, who was our stage manager, David Renton, and I'm forgetting somebody very important, and I can't think of his name, and he'll kill me if he sees this, who was an original member of the company. I want to say Robinson, but it wasn't. No. It will.
Oh, it's point looking it up.
Oh, it's terrible of me, but I can't think of his name.
Okay.
10 minutes.
Okay. Now I've come to the end of our formal questions, per se. And I think that... Could you hold camera, please? Pause. I think that we should spill... Thank you. And the last party member was, can you say it?
The last member, whose name I couldn't remember for a moment, of the original Neptune Theatre group was, of course, George Sperdakis, who was in Mary Mary and in Major Barber and a number of the shows.
Can we move actually to television experience then? When did you first start working in CBC Television?
I started working in CBC Television in the early 60s. Once I'd left Stratford and the Canadian Players, not only was it a source of income, which was essential, but it was fascinating. And in my first days of television, it was live. So that was as exciting as doing a live stage play. Even faster because you made a change in a 1-minute commercial or whatever. Yeah, so I started then. The big thing that happened, I think, for me was in the mid-'60s when I came back from the Neptune and went back to the CBC to meet an old friend of mine, Ron Wayman, who was a producer, who said, I'm doing a new series and there's a part for you if you'd like to play it. Handed me a script, and it was the first script for the series Wojek, which became quite famous, starring my friend John Vernon. And I played the Crown Attorney Arnie Bateman, who was slightly slimy guy who was constantly having to rethink his ethics because Wojek wouldn't let him get away with anything that wasn't straight to the solar plexus of authority or authoritarian people.
Do you remember some of the other theatre people who were involved in that?
Practically the whole... We had a very small acting pool in television in those days, thinking back on it now. Particularly when you think, if you discount all the English performers, and this was very Canadian, so there weren't that many. So that people like Tom Harvey, Bruno Gerussi, Alfie Scott, who gained fame years later as the clown on Howdy Doody with Peter Muse, Hugh Webster, people like that, others whose names escape me at the moment, whose names you would know. Again, it was like a rep company because the pool wasn't that big of very strong performers.
You mentioned another series.
After Wojciech closed, there was a series coming up about an action line reporter. And because I hadn't had the lead on Wojciech, I was dying to play this part of this action line reporter. Ron Wayman, who was the producer, didn't want me to do it because he thought I was too well known as Arnie Bateman. And Arnie, as I say, was slightly slimy, and McQueen, the actioneer, was your go for the gut newspaper reporter. So I fought for it, and I auditioned for it. The only time I ever really went after a part, and I got it. And I did that for the next 2 years in the late 60s, early 70s. And that was my favorite show because it was mine. Wojciech, which you can still see occasionally, was great fun, but I was a permanent member, but it was John's show, and rightly so.
You worked with Kate Reid, who obviously can't speak for herself. Can you tell me a little about her?
I knew Kate from the time when she was very young. She was very beautiful. She had the biggest, brownest eyes you ever saw, that looked like you just stumbled into a clearing and come across Bambi, or Bambi's mother, this frightened. And in this beautiful face, and there was this, I think, tormented soul and incredible talent. Slightly mad. I can remember driving down the street one night, a bunch of us, a chap by the name of Henry Kaplan, who still directs soaps in New York, was a close friend of Kate's and all of us, and he was driving the car, and he was and Kate was in the back seat, putting her arms over his eyes constantly while he was driving, so that Henry in the car, it was late at night, of course, and we would be coming back from some show. She was an incredible, frightened, strong, this mixture of all these things chewing away.
I'm running out of exactly which. Pause, please. I will ask a question. I'm sorry to be a little more backward-looking than that. Having learned directing and directed television a lot in the 1970s and drawn on your own directorial talent, how do you see that television was different in the early days? With the live television and so forth, you would have a pretty good concept of what it was like technically and what you had to put up with.
The big thing, of course, was you had more than one camera for dramas. You had what we called multi-cameras, usually 3, sometimes 4. I have used as many as 5. Sometimes now they use even more. And you had, usually one of them would go wrong. So that having rehearsed the play, when in the live days, you might suddenly be down to 2 cameras and all hell would break you loose for the director and the cameraman. Fortunately, I was never directing television. By the time I started directing television, we had tape, and we could stop and redo things, which meant it was much easier on the director. And if you had them all together, there is a term which I can't think of, then you could run all 3 of them all the time, and then when you edited, you could edit back and forth without worrying about being out at all. But that was the big difference. When we started the Wojciech was when Ron went to 1 camera, outdoors, 16 mil, filming, and took Canadian television out into the streets. And that's one of the reasons why Wojciech was such a big success. took it out of the studio. Although studio television used to be wonderful, because I did shows where we had lakes in old Studio 7 that they won't let you do now, because you just pull the plug and let it all drain away and it would go down the sewer. We would build, I had Dieppe, did the invasion of Dieppe in Studio 7. We would do all these kind of plays, whether they were classics or new plays, with the multi-cameras. And that was great.
That's very informative. It certainly helps. A pause, please.
Cromwell.
No.
He reviewed...
Run tape, please. Thank you. Who are we talking about?
When the first year I joined Stratford was the last year of the tent. And the tent was an incredible place to work. You felt, standing on the stage, that you could reach out and touch the back row. And if it wasn't raining, or the trains weren't going through, it was fabulous. If it rained hard, we had to stop, because you couldn't hear a word. And then when the rain stopped, Skip Manley, his name was, who was the tent master, would come along with a long pole with a hook on it and punch a hole in the tent to release the water, so that the audience would have to move and let the water, and then they'd come back in. I can remember once we were doing a play and we'd had a rain stop, and the first person to come on was Eric when we started the play again, and he came out from the back under the balcony, and he came to the end under the balcony, and he stood there and he looked at the audience. Then he stuck his hand out and looked up to him. Of course, the audience went bananas. We had them totally back. This was 3/4 of an hour delay. They were right back with us again, and the play went on. The next year we did the first year of the new theatre, which was bigger and had the balcony, was wider around the sides, so you lost that intimacy while gaining, I don't know how many more seats. Shame, I think. I think the tent seated 11 or 1,200, so it wasn't tiny. But the new theatre, seats 2,000. But it lost that quality. We used to always perform from the back of the theatre down to the stage in the tent. We were always running around the back, voices coming from the back, voices in the distance. From camp to camp, you'd hear voices talking. The band would be out playing trumpet calls and that out in the back. You had to stop doing that when we got the new theatre, because A, you had the corridor, B, you had the balcony up there, so if you did anything at the back underneath, nobody up there could see you. Shame.
Stratford was the scene for so many triumphs. I think of Douglas Campbell, I think of Bruno Drusi and Otello. Henry V, was it? Chris Plummer?
Chris, well, I was in that.
Can you tell me about that production?
That's the one we took to the Edinburgh Festival, along with their production of not Oedipus Rex, done in masks. The Henry V was exciting, partly because Chris was terribly exciting as Henry, partly the staging, which was Michael's. We were really using that open thrust stage, as I was saying earlier, with coming down to the constant flow of action from around the tent down onto the stage, up onto the balcony, constant back and forth and in and out, which was terribly exciting. And the whole feeling of involving of the audience being in the action, because we were always behind them and in front of them and doing scenes in the aisles. So, yeah, great days.
Yeah, I read the New York Times review on Chris Plummer. It's almost like A Star Is Born kind of thing.
He was meant. I was sick with envy, of course. Sick with envy. Here I was playing the Irish captain, MacMorris, with one or two scenes. And there's Chris up there with that profile. Once more into the breaching.
Prince of the stage, really. Anyway.
Prince of the stage.
And Jessica Tandy and Hume Cronin were supporters of the concept, right?
Yes, but we never knew them in those days. They became much more involved years later after I had left. The English actor had been there the year before playing Oedipus. The star, big star. No, he'd been there the first year. Alec Guinness was there the first year, and James Mason. James Mason had done, which is incredible for you to think of a huge star to come to play Oedipus Rex in a mask where you never saw his face. He had that unique voice. Dougie played it the year that I joined the festival. We were all the old timers, the old folks, the town folk, and it was a very hot summer. And we used to spend all our scenes, we had on these huge masks and we're hunched over, and we spent all the time trying to figure out a way how we could take turns to disappear down the vomitorium so we could lift our mask off and get a bit of fresh air before we'd crawl back up on stage and say to somebody, okay, you go, I'll stay.
In a paragraph, Douglas Campbell.
In a paragraph. You can't describe Douglas Campbell in a paragraph. Unique personality, excellent director, excellent actor, the most he is a vegetarian. What do they call people who are against wars? A pacifist. He's the most rabid, angry pacifist as a young man that I'd ever met. He was constantly on the verge of physical fights because of his strong opinions. But a total pacifist. And when in control, a brilliant actor, a fabulous personality to tour with. Dougie and I toured for years with the Canadian Players, and he was great to be with. We drank a lot, played cards a lot, played a lot.
Did you know Leo Chicheri, by the way?
Only slightly. Leo came from Montreal. He was never at Stratford when I was there. And of course he had that terrible accident on the 401 one year. So I never knew, and I never worked with Leo.
Robertson Davies, if you worked there?
Robertson Davies, no, I never worked. I did a couple of plays of Robertson's with the Straw Hat Players, Fortune My Foe, and a one-act play of Robertson's. And the only thing I remember about Robertson then was that he was editor of the Peterborough Examiner, and he did reviews. And he reviewed us at Stratford. I'm not sure when I was playing Lancelot Gallo or another comedy part, but he allowed us how I was not the kind of English Shakespearean clown that could make